Welcome to See You on the Other Side, where the world of the mysterious collides with the world of entertainment. A discussion of art, music, movies, spirituality, the weird, and self-discovery. And now, your hosts, musicians and entertainers who have their own weakness for the weird, Mike and Wendy from the band Sunspot.
Well, after spending some time in the warmth of the American Southwest, I'm so happy to be here in the 30 degrees of Wisconsin, preparing for our hopefully last snowstorm of the year.
Welcome back, Mike. And
Thank
officially
you.
Now, I can congratulate you in the present tense because you finished another marathon, your fifth one.
Yes, ma'am.
So you can count them all on one hand still, but not by not by much.
That's right. It was real fun out in the desert.
Awesome. How'd it go?
Pretty good. The first couple miles were actually down the side of a mountain in the dark.
Oh, yeah. Did you roll?
I should have rolled. Actually, well, they didn't have a lot of lights. So really the whole time you're just hoping you're not going to, because there was 3,000 people running the full marathon. So the whole time you're hoping not to trip on somebody and die.
Running in the dark is scary.
It is, but I was hoping we'd be illuminated by the Phoenix lights.
Yeah. And did you see anything interesting in the sky?
No, unfortunately, no UFOs. But the sunset or the sunrise over the mountains in the desert was something spectacular.
Fantastic.
So that was fun. Thank you very much. Now, you got to explore the Bay Area. Did you see anything paranormal out there?
Didn't actually see anything paranormal, but did visit a few different stops that had reported ghost stories.
Okay.
One of them being a delicious pizza place.
Hey, that's cool.
Pleasanton, California, called the Gay 90s. And
All
so
right.
that they actually have a plaque outside that talks about the history of the place and also the fact that there's a lady in blue seen in the upper window occasionally. So she's their ghost. And one of the waiters actually was talking about weird stuff going on there all the time. So it sounds like it's still an active place. We didn't actually witness anything ourselves, but we did have some phenomenal pizza there. I highly recommend it if you're in the area.
Fantastic. The Gay
And
90s.
maybe you'll see the lady.
Pleasanton, California.
Yeah.
All right, cool. Check it out. Well, that sounds like fun. You know what else is fun, Wendy?
What else is fun, Mike?
Talking to Nick Redfern.
Oh, gosh, yes. It's great.
Yeah, we're super
He has so many things to talk about, too.
He
that
does.
we love.
Like, it says like Nick's written over 40 books, but I kind of think it's over 400 at this point.
It's amazing.
Like, yeah, I mean, his width and breadth of paranormal knowledge is something spectacular. And I'm excited that he brings that width and breadth of knowledge to bear on the Slenderman.
Yes.
I mean, that's something that we've talked about on the show sporadically before. I'm actually in Nick's book.
All right. Congratulations.
Yes, we talk a little bit about different stories in Waukesha, talk about some of the weirdness that's happened in Waukesha in the past.
And as the ghost tour guide in Waukesha, I'm very familiar with the Slenderman tragedy that occurred there.
Yeah. And so we talk about that. Allison, who's in the interview with Nick, she also is in the book, and T is in the book too from the Milwaukee Paranormal Conference. So it's really it's like
all our buddies.
Right, our Wisconsin group gets featured in Nick's Slenderman book, and it's a really well written book. And if I do say so myself, being in it, no. But the thing is, but it has a whole bunch of things that I've never thought of that I think is the first time bringing some of this stuff to light. And you're going to hear all about that in the interview. And Allison actually found something, and we'll talk about this too. Allison discovered something, or was the first to bring something to the light about a relationship between what happened at Waukesha and Coast to Coast AM. That's also very interesting. And,
oh, wow.
And I didn't know that. I don't even talked about this. I had to read it in the book. She's my sister. I had to read it in the book. So anyway, I think you guys are really going to enjoy this conversation with the extraordinary Nick Redfern. Returning to the podcast today is Nick Redfern, the author of over 40 books on ufology, cryptozoology, secret societies, conspiracies, and the paranormal. He is joining us today to talk about his brand spanking new book, The Slenderman Mysteries. Nick, welcome back to See You on the Other Side.
Hey guys, well thanks for having me on again.
Absolutely. Thank you for making us part of this book too. We're really excited. Allison and I are both we have conversations with Nick because we have our own connections to the Slender Man, and we'll be talking about that in a little bit. But Nick, starting out, what got you into the Slender Man in the first place? What was the inspiration behind you getting yourself into this?
Well, basically, I mean, I was aware of it when it first began in 2009, when it was essentially a contest set up by the Something Awful website to see who could come up with the weirdest, creepiest fictional character for the internet era. And so I was fully aware of it back then, but didn't take that much notice of it, just purely and simply because it was a contest on the internet with nothing else. But what sort of really caught my interest was within sort of a handful of months after the creation, if you like, of the Slender Man, people were starting to claim to see the Slender Man in the real world as well. And that's when it sort of really caught my attention, the idea that maybe, we were seeing something along the lines of like a thought form, a tulpa, the idea of enough people believing in something and then it suddenly springs into life. And so I followed the story extensively, when these weirder aspects of the Slender Man phenomenon began to surface. And over the years, I'd still keep following it and occasionally forget about it. And then I realized that, with the 10th anniversary coming up next year of the creation of the Slender Man, I realized there'd actually only been one non-fiction book written on the subject in that almost 10-year period. And that was by Robin Swope, who wrote Slender Man from Fiction to Fact. So I thought, well, why not sort of go back and look at the whole thing from 2009 right through to now and look at all the different theories as to how the Slender Man may have come to life and go back to the origins, but also look at additional cases that predated the Slender Man and how it's actually it's come to impact on so many lives, and usually, not always, but usually in a very sort of deadly, dangerous, and negative fashion.
And so for the members of the audience who may not be completely familiar with the Slender Man, let's get this out right away that the Slender Man is a fictional character created just to scare people on the internet, right? He's like a Freddy Krueger or a Jason Voorhees. I mean, there's no, at least as far as we know, or, I know in your book you talk about some of these cross-cultural similarities, but the Slender Man was created from whole cloth, right? It wasn't, based on some account of something real that happened beforehand, correct?
Well, not consciously, at least, yeah. Basically, what happened in June 2009, you had this contest set up by the people at Something Awful, and basically it was sort of a contest. It wasn't sort of a hoax or anything like that. It was just a competition to see who could come up with the weirdest, most sinister, creepiest character that the internet has never seen. And of course, you're right, it was sort of like a Freddy Krueger or a Jason Voorhees for the internet era. And various people submitted ideas and concepts, and one of them was Eric Knudsen. And Eric Knudsen was the guy who created the Slender Man, the imagery, the appearance, the black suit, the faceless face, the long arms, extremely tall, sort of 7 to 9 feet tall, skinny, and with these tentacle-like, octopus-like appendages coming out of its back and its side.
The tentacles are my favorite part.
They always are.
that kind of really, gives it sort of a creepy side to it. And what happened was that the one that really caught everybody's attention was Eric Knudsen's Slender Man. And what he did was to also upload a couple of Photoshop pictures which showed the Slender Man in the presence of groups of children, which sort of almost immediately instilled the idea that the Slender Man was like a dangerous figure to children. And from there, you had other people sort of very, very quickly got into all this, and it became almost like a meme, if you like. And but in no time at all, literally, other people were creating their own stories and backstories concerning the Slender Man, posting them online, and forums in the name of the Slender Man were set up, and chat rooms, blogs, and it really became a phenomenon, not in years or months, but literally weeks. And then you had this incredibly popular fictional online series called Marble Hornets, which was basically almost kind of like a found footage type situation, of a bunch of friends trying to figure out what this creepy character is. And that is the early part of it, and that's how it went on, for, as I said, for several months, with nothing strange involved at all. It was just, the only strange thing was the speed with which it took off, and the way in which people, even though they realised it was fictional, the speed with which people became obsessed with it. And in many cases, obsessed is not an incorrect word. It's actually completely accurate,
And I mean, that's the scary thing, to think that, where does this inspiration come from? Mm-hmm. We usually attribute inspiration to the writer, to whoever came up with these things. But in ancient Greece, they used to think that inspiration came from a muse. And so, what do you think, Nick, about the possible paranormal origins of something that really captivated people so deeply and so suddenly?
Well, yeah, I mean, that's a good question, Alison. I'll tell you for why. Because there is sort of a school of thought, if you like, that doesn't think that Eric Knudsen actually created it himself. Now, by that, I don't mean the story is false as to how it was created. The theory is that Eric Knudsen may subconsciously have tapped into some kind of earlier archetype unknowingly and brought it forward for the modern era. Now, I'll explain what I mean by that. When Eric Knudsen created the Slender Man, it didn't just sort of come from his imagination as such. He was, by his own admission, he was inspired by things like actually a number of different things. One of them was a creepy creature that existed or was reported in the 1940s in the little town of Mattoon, Illinois, a character known as the Mad Gasser of Mattoon, which a lot of your listeners may not have heard of, but it's a weird story from the 1940s of this tall, sort of thin character dressed in black who would invade people's homes in the middle of the night. And the room would become filled with this noxious odor like brimstone or sulfur, which is often tied to paranormal activity. Mm-hmm. And the person would be sort of paralyzed in the bed. But he was inspired by that imagery. Now, Eric Knudsen was also inspired by the works of H.P. Lovecraft, and that almost certainly was why, he had these tentacles, kind of like Cthulhu, Lovecraft was sort of obsessed with sort of strange, rubbery, tentacled types of creatures,
Dr. Zoidberg.
What's that?
Oh, Dr. Zoidberg from Futurama. I always think about him when I think of Cthulhu.
Oh. Yeah, and but one of the interesting theories about Lovecraft is, his writings and these descriptions of these strange creatures and monsters and these ancient ruined cities and things like this. A number of people who followed the Lovecraft stories, if you like, believe that Lovecraft himself didn't actually, like Knudsen possibly, didn't actually create the stories themselves. What they believe is that Lovecraft, when he went to sleep at night, he would sort of astrally plane, into other realms and dimensions. In other words, the ancient cities that he thought he was seeing in his dreams, and the same with these creatures, he may actually have tapped into brief glimpses of other forms of reality, multi-dimensions, things like that. And so the theory is that in the same way that Lovecraft thought he was creating things like Cthulhu and various other creatures and and also, these ancient ruined cities and things like this, that he may actually have had a glimpse into another reality. And possibly that could have been the case also with Eric Knudsen, that by his own admission, he was inspired by Lovecraft. And if Lovecraft was inspired by things in other realms of existence, then who knows where reality and imagination begin and end, and where they start to cross.
And what I love about that right there is that it kind of ties into the whole thing. When they printed up versions of the Necronomicon, like in the late 1960s, and they would put it in like bookstores, and you just had this printed version of the Necronomicon, and there'd be nothing about how it was fiction in the book. And people would sit there and they'd go like, oh my God, I read about this book in this H.P. Lovecraft story, and there really is a Necronomicon. And of course, when they sell evil books, they're going to sell them at the mall. At the mall in Peoria, Illinois, obviously, because that's not too far away from where the Mad Gasser happens.
Right.
But that's, I love that it all kind of, even the fiction, it's like, well, what if it wasn't fiction? And that kind of even ties into when I was making that Freddy Krueger comment before. In 1994, Wes Craven made a movie called New Nightmare, and that he did Freddy Krueger into the real world. That he had dipped into that kind of cosmic knowledge or whatever when he was dreaming or trying to create the character. And then that meant that the character was able to come into the real world. And so I think that kind of idea that H.P. Lovecraft could have been dipping into something much more real than anything we realize. Well, that's the kind of stuff that is why I need to wear diapers to bed.
Well, that was one reason.
Say that on live radio.
I want to interject here too so did H.P. Lovecraft, was he tormented by these visions, or,
Oh, yeah.
what? Yeah, I mean, tell us a little bit more about that, because that's fascinating to me. The idea that, maybe there's something real there, or maybe there's, you're just, such an incredible writer that you have this pure, imagination that, becomes real to you. Speak a little bit about H.P. Lovecraft's experiences.
Well, yeah, I mean, that's a good question or observation, because, most people have sort of heard of Cthulhu and Yog-Sothoth, the more sort of well-known creatures that Lovecraft created and inspired other people to write about them as well. But there's a lesser-known creature that invaded Lovecraft's nightmares, if you like, and he called them NightGaunts, and they were sort of these creatures, these winged creatures that would take him from his bedroom in, the dead of night, and take him to the clouds, and then drop him back down to the rooftops, and then he would wake up in sort of a clammy cold sweat, and it was just a dream. Or was it just a dream, but what's interesting is that Lovecraft's mother, she began to see these so-called NightGaunts as well. And now somebody might say, well, this is just, her son's telling her what happened, and her mind's focused on it, and then she starts to dream about it. But that may not be the case. It could well be the case that something that impacted on Lovecraft, these sort of hideous flying NightGaunts, could actually then turn the tables on his mother as well. So, you have a lot of strange aspects where fiction and fact cross over, where imagination and dreaming cross over, to the point where all four of them all exist in a sort of one hazy realm, so to speak. Now, there's no doubt that regardless of whether it was real or not, there's no doubt, he was a very good atmospheric writer, and his writing style was copied by so many. If somebody said the tree was shaking outside, for Lovecraft it would be the dark and shadowy tree creaked, as some terrible shadows descended upon the old house. He would pull one sentence into make it into four, but he did it in a really kind of entertaining way, which didn't become tiresome. You know, he had his own style. But, you know, this idea that when we dream, we're not actually just dreaming. I mean, sometimes a dream is just a dream because sometimes you dream about things that happen in the day. But then on other occasions, something seems so vivid and real, and you see faces and people that you've never seen. And you know you've never seen them, but you see them in the dream. You know, you might forget afterwards, but you remember at the time. So, you know, this idea that the dream state is just something in your mind, maybe it really isn't. Maybe, you know, we actually do enter some other realm of reality, and maybe Lovecraft did that on regular occasions, found a way, either consciously or not, to do it, and then essentially downloaded it into his book, so to speak, but not realizing he was doing it even, you know, and maybe that's what happened also with the Slenderman, that it was, yes, it was a new creation, but was it based on earlier archetypes that are sort of deep in our ancient subconscious, and perhaps things like inherited memory, that kind of thing?
Yeah, well, you know, this makes me think of, you know, other writers like Stephen King. I remember hearing a radio program called The Rest of the Story years ago, and talking about how, you know, he became, you know, he wrote about these things because, you know, he had these night terrors, which inspired him. And then I teach at a Native American school, and just last week we had Joseph Bruchac, who is a Abenaki storyteller and writer, and has, you know, quite a number of books out. And he was talking about a book that he wrote called Skeleton Man, which is about a cannibal creature similar to the woodland tribes' idea of something called the Wendigo, which was, you know, a man driven mad by hunger during, you know, the winter when there's nothing to eat, you know, so much so that he eats his family, and then goes roaming about the woods looking for other victims, and, you know, was a man, but then becomes a monster, a skeletal beast, you know, that is so very thin that it is just a skeleton. And, you know, thinking of a fearsome creature like that roaming the woods reminds me of Slenderman. But my point here is that Joseph Bruchac said that this story just came to him in a dream. He was dreaming, and you know, his whole book like came flooding out of him one morning. So he had been dreaming, and then he awoke to hearing his main character speaking to him. And then he just sat right down and just started typing like a madman. And then, you know, his wife was coming in, and then she came in and she said, you know, hey, Joseph, you know, and then he's like, oh, well, I don't need breakfast. And she's like, breakfast? I was coming to get you for dinner. So he had been sitting there for hours and hours, and it just all came to him in one fell swoop through a dream. So it's curious to me to think about, you know, what kind of life forms we might have out there in what we thought was imagination, and how they can reach out to us.
Yeah, and I think the big issue, of course, is most people don't realize that, you know, they assume a bad dream or a weird dream was just simply that and nothing else. But, you know, it may not be. I mean, if you look back at the ancients, I mean, you know, they put a lot of stock in dreams, that they, you know, that they meant something, that they weren't just a dream. You know, there was a reason or a you know, a message in relation to the dream. So, you know, I think I mean, had we not got sort of people talking about the Slender Man in the real world, I don't think we'd be having this conversation now. It's only because it really did become externalized. You know, it became something that went beyond just the internet, and particularly when people started to see it. So I think, you know, that angle of it coming to life, whether it, you know, people see it in sleep paralysis or literally outside the window, etc., you know, is sort of less important than the fact that it is being seen. So perhaps in the same way that Lovecraft's mother was similarly infected, if you like, maybe that's what's happening now, that the dreams and ideas and imaginations are now sort of swirling around the real world.
Well, and Nick, that's funny because that's exactly where I was going to go when you were talking about Lovecraft's mother being infected. It's that idea of the idea virus, that things spread. Like, we joke about memes, that memes spread on the internet. We see something, we share it, they see it, they share it. Things become viral. We use that term for anything that we share with each other. But, it makes me think about Lovecraft's circle, the Lovecraft circle of all the other authors that he would write to.
Yeah.
And you think of, Robert Bloch, that's a Wisconsin connection. Robert Bloch, who wrote Psycho, lived in Milwaukee. August Derleth, who lived in Sauk Prairie, Wisconsin, which is about, 5 or 6 miles from where I am right now. And he's the guy that kept H.P. Lovecraft's stories going after Lovecraft died in the first place, and founded the Arkham House, publishing company. And so there's, you keep those ideas going. Or who wrote Conan? Oh, Robert... It's on the tip of my tongue.
Robert Howard.
Conrad?
Yes, no, Robert Conrad's the fat guy from Jake and the Fat Man. That's Robert Conrad.
Sorry.
But no, Robert E. Howard from Plano.
There we go.
He lived in Plano, Texas. But he was also part of the Lovecraftian circle. And there's even a Conan story, The Tower of the Elephant, that uses a Lovecraftian monster at its basis. The elephant in the Tower of the Elephant is actually a Lovecraftian creature. And so it's funny that he was an idea virus when it came to these stories, because other people extended the Cthulhu mythos after he died. And it almost seems like the Slender Man would fit right in to the Cthulhu mythos, and that idea that they're tapping into something that's a archetype of something that humans are afraid of, just in our DNA, like the insects or the devil, in 5 million years to Earth, that we have that genetic, or a Quartermass in the Pit is what I'm thinking of.
Oh, I love that movie.
We all love Quartermass in the Pit. But that idea that there's a genetic memory we have that we're bred into, and that's kind of what I wanted to get into, asking about what are some of the similar tales in different cultures that have almost Slendermanian qualities.
Well, one of the most famous ones that a lot of people have heard of would be the kids' fairy tale, folk tale of the Pied Piper of Hamlin. Hamlin being a town in Germany, and it's essentially like a kid's folk story, but it really is kind of a disturbing story if you read it, and you literally take it all in, and in the story. The town of Hamlin is infested by a plague of rats, just thousands and thousands of rats running around. One day, this strange character comes into town. He's described in the early versions of the stories like tall and thin, and has kind of an unusual appearance. And he offers to get rid of the rats. And the way that he does it, he has this like a supernatural flute, which when he plays the flute, it hypnotizes the rats, and they follow him, in sort of, zombie-like style towards the local river, and they all tumble into the river and drown. So there's no more rats. From there, the mayor then goes back on his pledge to pay the piper, and so instead what happens is that the piper then turns the tables on the people of Hamlin, and while the parents, the adults, are all in the church one particular morning, the kids are outside playing, and he suddenly starts to play the flute, and all the kids are entranced and hypnotized and start to follow him. All but 3 kids, one who's unable to walk, one who is unable to hear, and one who's unable to see. And they're the 3 who tell the parents and the adults what happened. But in the story, you have this tall, thin character hypnotizing kids and taking them into the woods and ultimately to this mountain where they walk through the side of the mountain, which kind of sounds today like a portal or something like that, and they're never seen again. And that's sort of, a classic example of this, something that sounds very much like the Slender Man, that has the ability to, sort of get people under its control and, almost in a hypnotic state, and that is dangerous to children. You've got all those aspects right there.
And also it's a lesson in, like, they crossed the Slender Man. You know, like they made it. You made the deal with the devil, and when you tried to, when you bluffed, the devil called you bluff and killed all your kids.
Yeah.
So that's, the Pied Piper is always such a, you're like, oh, the Pied Piper. You always have that story of like, and he was playing his flute and people were just passing by, and, and the rats were just following him. And we always talk about the first half of the story in like a winsome kind of way, like, oh, see, they're following him like he's some kind of Pied Piper, when really the Pied Piper is like a John Wayne Gacy-esque child murderer.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Very strange story, yeah.
Yeah, it is. And so there's that in Germany, and they also have der Grossmann, which literally means the big man.
Yeah, and again, like the der Grossmann, is another classic example of sort of a tall, strange, humanoid male figure that terrifies children, pursues them, and just again, like has a memorable name, like the Pied Piper, the Slenderman, der Grossmann. They all kind of evoke something that's a little bit unsettling, even if you're not sure why. I think it's just the fact, just the term. People kind of just feel a little bit unsettled. The Slenderman, just its name, kind of evokes something weird and skinny and spidery,
Especially in Wisconsin, because we have no slender men in Wisconsin.
Too much cheese.
Okay, right. Too much cheese. Okay. So Germany's one example of a culture, and then also in Ireland they have the I don't know if I'm saying this right, but it's like looks like fear dub.
Yeah. Well, that was another example as well, and that's another example of a demonstration of sort of like a dangerous, hostile, murderous, humanoid type figure, that was a threat to everybody, and what was seen as like an early kind of Bogeyman kind of thing, and you can find these all around the world, really. It's not just applicable to one country or one culture. You can probably find, in every large town, in just about all around the world, you'll find stories of, a haunted bridge where if you cross the bridge and knock on the edge of the bridge or whatever, the old lady will appear for you. There's variations on that. You'll find them in America, England, Russia, everywhere, you know what I mean? And but then you have to wonder, well, if those kind of Bogeyman-type characters, like the Grossman, the Pied Piper, and so on, and Fear Dub, if they appear all around the world, is it like a collective unconscious all connecting, or is it that those early archetypes really were seen at all those places, and became, again, sort of something that may have started as an urban legend, but then with so many people really believing the old lady is at the bridge, she suddenly appears, here, there, and everywhere.
And that's kind of what I wanted to get to there, because we have the Tulpa part of it, and I want to talk about where people started having real sightings of the Slenderman, this fictional character. This character who's just made to scare the crap out of you, and it's a fun internet thing that Eric Knudsen comes up with, or does he come up with it really? The Slenderman visits him in a dream with his little tentacles over his brain. But is it because maybe I think that we think about the humanoid, the dressed up, the face is messed up kind of thing? I immediately think of the gentleman from Buffy the Vampire Slayer.
Me too.
And I think of the Silence from Doctor Who. And, we have these, and even the Greys, the alien Greys, who we've been staring at them since Whitley Strieber wrote Communion 30 years ago. We've been looking at them in supermarket lines. But that idea of the human face that's not quite human, it's missing something to it. Because we're so saturated with those images already, that it becomes easier for us to imagine them. And then because it's easier for us to imagine them, it's easier for us to project them. So I kind of wanted to get in, when did the Slender Man first get seen?
Well, the earliest I've got, and bear in mind it was sort of created in June 2009, the earliest story that I have is from September 2009. Now, granted, that story came to me since the book has come out. Prior to that, it was sort of into 2010. But the earliest one I've got is from 2009, and this involved a young woman, well, young woman now, but a young girl then, and she had an experience which was like classic sleep paralysis, and this was in the town of Paris, Texas, which is actually not too far from where I live, just a few hours drive. And in this case, she had like classic sleep paralysis, waking up in the middle of the night, seeing this thing in the room, which she described as classic Slenderman, a tall, spindly, thin character in a black suit, white shirt, skinny black tie, a completely faceless face, and but not the tentacles, no tentacles, but everything else. And she said it loomed over the bed, and and again in typical sleep paralysis style, she was unable to move. But at one point, she was able to break the spell of paralysis. Now, unlike a lot of people who, when they break the paralysis, the entity, whether it's a monster, a demon, a Slenderman, when you break that paralysis, the creature's gone immediately. But in her case, she said she remembered pushing herself back to the further and further to the headboard of the bed. And she said, I was 100% wide awake, and it was still in the room then. And it was like 15 seconds or so later after that, where it was almost like a standoff, just staring at each other, that then it vanished. But she said by that time, she was fully wide awake, and she was absolutely sure of that. So that kind of suggests it wasn't just a mind-based nightmare or experience. It was externalized, and she broke out of it and saw it, at least she said, like 15 seconds or so, while she was fully wide awake.
And that's terrifying, because I don't know if you guys ever had a hypnagogia experience.
I have.
Yeah, you wake up, you're kind of in that half, and then you see a bunch of weird stuff, and you're like, oh man, and you're terrified or whatever. And then, but as soon as you hit awake, it all kind of poof.
Yeah.
Yeah. So if you know that's going to happen, and you expect everything to go poof, yet the Slender Man, and we're all sitting there like, yeah, classic Slender Man. So skinny and terrifying. But but the fact is, if you wake up and he's still there, now you've got yourself something different than just a normal hypnagogia experience.
Yeah, and I think it's worth noting that the girl told me how, and she admitted this, and she actually doesn't really have much to do with the subject anymore now, that she did actually get really kind of obsessed with it all really quickly, and did take part in like the chat rooms and the forums, and she did have 2 occasions where she wrote her own little stories and uploaded them to one particular forum to add to sort of the growing mythology or whatever. And you find that a lot. It's the ones who get obsessed with it that say it's almost as if the Slender Man has come to life. And when you focus on it so deeply, it's almost like a burglar alarm goes off, and it gets alerted to who's thinking about it, who's talking about it, and then it appears for them. And I get a lot of Men in Black stories like that. The weirder Men in Black stories, not the Will Smith, Tommy Lee Jones types, but where people have been talking about them, and they get weird sounds on the telephone, and or they start to have weird dreams of the Men in Black, which don't seem like normal dreams. And you see so many of these paranormal entities that seem to know when we're focusing on them, and then we become part of their manipulated reality, if you like.
Well, I like that too. Well, I don't like that, because the idea that we talk, like now we're talking about Slender Man for like an hour, and like I'm gonna, wake up in the middle of the night and he's just gonna be standing over me.
He's gonna visit you tonight.
Right, his tentacles will be dripping on me while I'm.
You'll love it.
But the thing is that that particular idea almost reminds me of Robert Damon Schneck's The Bye-Bye Man.
Oh, The Bye-Bye Man. Yes, I was thinking about that too.
Yeah, that's a perfect example.
And not the cheesy movie, but the which had some scares, I'll admit. But the original story is that the more you talk about him, the more you think about him, the more you're making an antenna for him to come and get you.
Yeah, that's just irresistible. But my question is, how do we really know the difference between like tulpa or predisposition or delusion? I mean, it seems very murky at this point.
Well, I mean, what I would say is I don't think the phenomenon can be explained in just one way. I mean, when I think there's a tendency with our minds, we try and put everything, into one category because it's the simplest way to understand it. But I mean, if you look at the Slender Man, we have Eric Knudson's creation from his own mind, but then we have a possible side aspect to it where maybe part of his imagination was being inspired for something else. Then you've got the possibility of a tulpa version, and then you've also got the ancient archetype, which may also come back to life because people sort of perceiving it, in a Slender Man type situation. So in other words, the phenomenon of the Slender Man in the real world may not just be one thing. It may not be just a tulpa. It may be, sort of the rebirth of these old archetypes, which have all been brought to life, but not necessarily as tulpas, but perhaps from some sort of other realm, and they've kind of crossed over. So I think there could be a number of answers to what's going on, and some of them, are going to be people who have descended into a state of paranoia and mental illness, and cannot distinguish reality from fiction. So I think the phenomenon itself is actually multiple things. It's not something that can be answered with just one theory, really.
Well, this is something that I was also thinking about when thinking about the Slender Man, and when you talked about the Mad Gasser, you mentioned that the idea that it's funny, the Mad Gasser, Mattoon, like it rolls off the tongue and it's easy, and we talk about the scent of sulfur. But we've talked about on this show numerous times about how sulfur accompanies Bigfoot sightings and UFO and ghost and demonic possession and all these kind of things. In any of the real-life Slender Man sightings that you investigated or talked to people about, Nick, were there any weird scents associated with him?
Yeah, there's actually, I've got either 3 or 4 cases where there was like an overpowering odor, and it was like one person actually described as like burning rubber, like a burning car tire was actually the term used, which is a good description. But that sort of burning rubber, sulfur, and one of them described it like the iron smell of blood, that kind of thing, and sort of a metallic, sort of sickly kind of odor, but where you can almost taste it as well. So, you do get those. Certainly they don't happen in every case, but there are some of them, and enough to suggest that there's the odor component is one that's worth, looking into further to see how deep these patterns actually are, So, but there's several things that I've noticed that often happen in these cases where it's come to life. One is the sleep paralysis angle. The other one is the odor. Then there's the angle of the person being sure they were wide awake and not, not just in a weird altered state of mind. They really were wide awake. And then, interestingly enough, what I found is that in most of the bedroom encounters, and this also applies to the girl from Paris, Texas, the reports that I've got of the Slender Man with the tentacles, they're all from when the creature's seen in the woods. I actually don't have any... Well, actually, I have one case of the Slender Man being seen in the bedroom with the tentacles, but in all the others, there aren't any tentacles. And if that was just one or two cases, but I've got a lot of cases now, and there's a clear trend that when they're in the bedroom, you don't hardly ever see the tentacles, which is kind of interesting. You know, I mean, why, if it was all a bunch of people hoaxing, why would they all kind of point out that little known angle? Because that doesn't even really pop up in the fictional stories. It's just a little lesser known aspect of the real reports, that it seems to be different in one location in terms of its appearance to another location.
Classic Slenderman always leaves the tentacles outside.
Yeah, leaving by the door.
I like the fact that you're starting to see patterns in the sightings too. That's kind of, it's exciting in the way that when you start to see trends, we can start developing at least some kind of, I don't know if theory is a good word, but or at least we're starting to get a little closer to more of a unified theory of what the Slender Man might be when we start to see patterns. But at the same time, you mentioned the obsession. And that obsession is what led to, what happened here in Wisconsin and right by Allison and my home turf in Waukesha, Wisconsin in 2014. And that was certainly a deal of some girls, some junior high school girls that were absolutely obsessed with this creature that they found on the internet to the point where they thought he was real. And I'm sure a lot of people have seen, there's a Slenderman documentary on HBO. It's been in the news constantly. And the girls were just convicted, actually, and sentenced to, multiple decades of years in the state mental hospital. And so, Nick, you finished your book a few months ago, and the sentences for these girls just came out. So is there anything in particular that you wish you would have added, or analysis, something like that you wish you would have added to the book because there's been extra Slenderman stuff that has come out since you finished writing it?
Well, fortunately, from the perspective of writing the book, I was able to continue writing the book right through November of last year, and so I got pretty close to the end of the story. And even at that point, it was clear that the girls, were going to be, out of society for decades. So at least I was able to get the conclusion, even though it wasn't the specifics, of the location where they'd be and how many specific years they would have. But yeah, this is sort of, the kind of the worst aspect of the whole Slenderman phenomenon, the way in which it, quite literally, destroys lives in terms of, people, whether you go with the paranormal angle or you go with the obsessive descending into, mental illness angle, or you think it's a bit of both. It so often ends in tragedy and disaster and, in this case, almost death. I think there's no doubt that the girls fully believed in the existence of the Slenderman. This was not some sort of conjured up story because they were evil and they wanted just to kill their former friend. That was not it at all. They really did believe in this. Now, of course, in a court case where you have judges and a jury and the police submitting evidence and data, you're not going to have a debate on the merits or otherwise of the supernatural angle. That's not what the courts are there for. The police were there to determine if, this was in a case of attempted murder, and from there, were they completely, have their complete faculties in their mind, or, should this be treated as a mental illness case, and should they be treated in relation to how somebody with a psychological condition has, in a hospital. So those were the areas that popped out in the the court case and everything else. But we didn't obviously get to see the supernatural aspect in that. But what did happen as sort of a byproduct of all this was that suddenly you had thousands, tens of thousands more people who'd not heard of the Slender Man before because they weren't part of that community, then suddenly thinking, who the hell's the Slender Man? What's this headline in the newspaper? Girl stabbed girl in the name of Slender Man. It captured people's attention and, took the whole thing to another level as well.
Well, a couple of things there. number one, for you guys, that if you're not quite familiar with this, the story we're talking about happened in Waukesha, Wisconsin. 2 girls took their friend out to a public park, and they stabbed her repeatedly as a sacrifice to the Slender Man, thinking the Slender Man would take them to up north Wisconsin and they'd be able to live with him in his Slender Palace. And so obviously the girls had some mental issues. They were local girls at the junior high that did this. And a couple of questions, Nick. Number one, is there anything with the girls' experience that you find is consistent with other people's experiences? And just delving into the possibilities of some kind of supernatural angle. And I know they didn't talk about this in court, but anything when you were doing the research of this where something the girls said matched up with anything other people had talked about?
Well, there were a couple of weird things where one of the girls, and this actually came from the family, woke up in the night with these scratches over her body as if something had, attacked her in the middle of the night, things like that. And, sort of dreams of strange creatures and things like this. So there was that aspect to it, and that did all predate the attack. Now, of course, the skeptic might say, well, all kids have weird nightmares of monsters in the closets and things like that, or under the bed. Another kind of archetype that are all around the world. When you're 3 or 4, the closet's slightly open and you think there's monsters in there, and the imagination of a young child, really is very different to our imagination as you get older. So there were a few things like that, but for the most part, it really came down to 2 girls having an intense, deep belief in the absolute existence of this creature, and that they had to do what they had to do to ensure that they would, in their own words, they would become like the Slender Man's proxy. And then the plan was, after they stabbed their former friend, who fortunately pulled through and has now made a full recovery, they were going to head off to the a forest. Well, I was going to say not too far away, but by foot it was a long way. And the plan was to meet the Slender Man in his creepy old mansion deep in the woods. And this wasn't a ploy, for insanity. They got the whole thing in their minds exactly as to what they were going to do and why they needed to do it. But as I said, there were a couple of weird little things like, these childhood experiences, which with hindsight, we could address them further. But like I said, in a court case, that's not even going to be relevant,
Right.
Now, Nick, you just were speaking of waking up with scratches. And, we talked previously about this, sickly smell that accompanied some people's Slenderman type experience. Did anyone else experience any other physical manifestations like scratches or other wounds or other sensory experiences related to the Slenderman besides, sight and smell?
Not really. I mean, I've not got sort of reports, where somebody's been severely, sort of punched or scratched, deep talons or anything like that. But I have got quite a few where I said you got the sleep paralysis, you've got the odors, but not sort of direct physical harm, where somebody, has been assaulted in that sense, not really anything like that. No. It seems it's more like for the most part, like a psychological attack. The Slender Man appears and then just looms over you, and, arguably just to create a strong sense of terror. And of course that ties in one of the theories, the idea of supernatural parasites, like psychic vampires, that perhaps the whole the whole reason for the manifestation is to create in the witness or the victim a sense of incredible fear and terror, which then the psychic vampire in the form of the Slender Man then feeds on it. So in other words, maybe the goal isn't just to terrorize people for the sake of it, but it's to essentially, as I said, get fuel and feed itself by terrorizing people, and that would be kind of, really disturbing if these stories of sort of energy-based vampires, psychic vampires, are literally using us as a food source in a very strange way.
That's straight out of Twin Peaks. The characters from the Black Lodge, the evil spirits from the Black Lodge, feed on human pain and suffering, which looks like cream corn, like a blackened cream corn, called garmonbosia. But that's
Delicious.
the idea. They create the human pain and suffering, and then you see them actually eat the garmonbosia, which is the people's pain and suffering that they created in the first place.
Yeah, that kind of ties in, that angle of feeding on us kind of ties in with the thought form tulpa idea as well. Enough people believe in something, it comes to life, but then it needs some way to sustain that life. So, all throughout culture, from tulpas, going back thousands of years to the modern era, energy-based, like hungry ghosts, vampires, things like that, they're all kind of tied in with bleeding us dry,
Speaking of the attack that happened in 2014 and those girls in Waukesha, I mean, Allison, didn't you talk about this in Nick's book, in that there was a Coast to Coast episode about the Slender Man like the week before?
Actually, it was the night before.
Right.
Yeah.
But let's get into that, because all of a sudden, I mean, remember every time George Norrie says, like, say your website on the show, we're going to blow your website away. We're going to turn your website off. It's going to get so much traffic. And he says
good.
that. But think about how he says that, and think about millions of people now who might have never heard about the Slender Man before, or think about a lot of the Coast to Coast listeners, they're AM radio listeners and stuff, maybe not plugged into the internet as much as people like us are, and they hear about this for the first time, captures their imagination. Like, that goes exactly into what you were just saying, Nick.
Yeah. I mean, that was the reason that I mentioned that to Nick, because it was so startling to me that, I'm a C2C subscriber. So I was listening to that show the next day. I was just cleaning the kitchen. And then, I hear on the news that the Slenderman attack had happened. And, I had been just listening to that show from the previous night about tulpas. That was the subject. And they were speculating about how the Slender Man, might be coming into reality and might become more evident and, affecting people because of its popularity, and because people started to report seeing it, and then I hear about the stabbing. So it was quite jarring for that.
And as you'll remember, Alison, the host that night was actually Dave Schrader.
That's right.
Oh yeah, Darkness Radio.
Just a couple of weeks ago, Dave, who's got his own show, Darkness Radio, he interviewed me about the Slender Man book, and it actually wasn't until he read the book, he was telling me when we did the interview, that he didn't even realize that the attack had actually taken place right after, just hours after the radio show, and he was kind of amazed and a bit disturbed as well by it all, and so it's impacted on a lot of aspects of the Slender Man phenomenon. This idea of talking about the tulpa aspect of the Slender Man, and thousands and thousands of people listening on the show, and then suddenly you can make a case the next day that Slender Man energy, so to speak, has reached its absolute peak.
Well, he should be disturbed by it because it's his fault.
Well, but what I did think as well is, the girls who perpetrated the stabbing and the victim, they were having a slumber party that night. So,
yeah.
I mean, there's always a possibility that, that is, more rooted in our consensual reality, that perhaps they were listening that night. That's a possibility too.
Yeah, I've actually wondered about if they were listening to the show. The only thing that, well, I won't say makes me think they weren't listening. The only thing I can rationalise it is that, both girls were extensively interviewed and carefully interviewed, partly because of their age, obviously. But had the police sort of covered every aspect of the story, from when their former friend came over, what they did, etc., I just would have thought that at some point that would have come up in the interviews. You know what I mean?
Yeah,
At one point or another. Yeah, but it never did. So, but we may never know, and now it's not really going to make any difference anyway, unless you're focusing on the paranormal angle of it all. But it's a very, at the very least, it's a really weird synchronicity,
Yeah, I mean, not just a weird synchronicity. Like when we're talking about mass belief bringing something to life, and then having it be. Because I know Darkness Dave used to host it on, Saturday nights, or once a month he would host on Saturday nights, and I always get excited because he always has good true crime or like good, really enjoyable shows. I mean, that's one of those synchronicities that you could eventually make a court case out of in the world of paranormal law. But in the world of real law, obviously not. And the thing is also that, Waukesha, Wisconsin, does have a long history of weird stuff. I wrote the Ghost Tour in Waukesha, and Wendy, our co-host on See You on the Other Side, she is a Waukesha Ghost Tour guide. And I did write a stop that does mention the Slender Man, which, depending on the crowd, it's a very touchy crowd because obviously people know Waukesha's not a big town, 60, 70,000 people. So people are going to know the families involved.
Yeah.
So you really got to be, you got to ride that line because somebody's going to ask about it. So you have to have a prepared response versus, not mentioning it all. And then somebody's drunk on the tour or whatever. They're like, what about that Slender Man? And then you got to have something ready for them. But the thing is, and my part in Nick's book, I talk about this, and we've talked about my shadow person experience before. And if you want to read the best version, make sure you buy Nick's book, The Slender Man Mysteries, because I give that one, I find I tell it the best in that one, and Nick retells it great. But Waukesha has a long history of weirdness, and I've seen some weird things in that town, and there was a history of like ghost hunts and, unfortunately, spiritualism, of course, child murder. So there's a very complicated history of a town that we would not consider very large, and this is where the Slender Man stuff happened. So, Nick, the last couple questions for you, and number one, thank you very much. I know you've had a super busy couple of weeks because this is your press blitz time, and so thank you for joining us.
Thanks. I'm always pleased to, do radio, because, you get good debates going, a lot of thoughts and ideas come forward, which I think the listeners enjoy when it's just not black and white, you actually go down some alternative avenues and whatever.
And it's always better to be able to elaborate on your ideas than just have a couple of quick quotes. But the thing is, Nick, so what do you think, so when you first came to the book and first came to writing, what aspect about it of your preconceptions of the Slender Man do you think changed the most by the time you got to the end? So you started, we always have an idea. We always try to remain obviously as impartial as possible, but everybody comes in with their preconceived notions and their personal prejudices. What did you start with that at the end was different?
Well, certainly, I think it would be the obsessive nature and how quickly it develops. I mean, when I saw that, it had a huge following, I kind of thought initially it was going to be along the lines of, a bunch of kids who, go crazy over the latest boy band that comes out, that kind of thing, and singing on stage.
The Slenderman.
Getting hysterical. Yeah, exactly. And so I thought it was going to be more like that, but it was far more like a darker and disturbing obsession, because what I found, it wasn't just that people were obsessing on the Slender Man, it was like they were almost, in their minds, sympathetic to it and felt they could relate to it and understand it. It's kind of almost like the sort of the Patty Hearst thing. You get kidnapped, and then you find you're on the kidnapper's side. And I think I found that happening more and more, which I didn't realize initially was going on. The fact that people were not just obsessing on it, they were relating to the Slender Man as well. He's one of us, or I'm one of his followers, that kind of thing. And, when it gets down to that kind of obsession, then it really does sort of get, really kind of dark, when people do sort of just, wow, this is what I've been waiting for. That's actually how a lot of kids have reacted to it. I mean, one of the people I interviewed for the book was Olaf Phillips, who runs Paranoia magazine. And he was telling me how he brought it up with his son once. Have you heard of the Slender Man? And his son went quiet, and finally got him to talk. And basically, in his class at school, all the kids were into it. They were all obsessed with it in his class. But the really kind of strange thing was, and again, sort of dark, disturbing thing, was that they'd all kind of agreed not to say anything to the parents, to the grown-ups, to the old people, and it was their little secret, and the adults were kept out of the loop. And so, you got this undercurrent of who knows how many kids across the planet in similar situations to Olaf's son, where they keep it to themselves and mom and dad don't need to know anything about this. That was one of the things that kind of, at the end of the story, became something that I didn't anticipate at the start of the story.
Yeah, that's so frightening.
The Pied Piper Slenderman Stockholm Syndrome.
Yeah, exactly.
And I mean, when you think of like the Bogeyman, for example, it's like when Mike and I were coming up, we weren't like looking into the closet going, "Hey, can I join up?"
Hell yeah, Bogeyman!
We were like, we want to get the hell out of there. We don't want to have anything to do with the Boogeyman.
Right. We wanted to be the Ghostbusters. We didn't want to be Gozer.
Yeah. So, right. We wanted to be the Ghostbusters. We didn't, we didn't even want to be Slimer. We didn't want to jump on over to the other side. So, I mean, that's really kind of a sickening aspect to think of, that kids want to be allied with, some kind of murderous evil spirit.
Well, yeah, I mean, it is one of these situations where, sort of sometimes darkness does come, just straight out into our reality in sort of unforeseen ways. And, and that's certainly the case with the Slender Man. The certain issues that cropped up time again, the obsession, the sense of being able to understand it or to relate to it, which is totally, the girls in Waukesha, that's exactly what they did. They felt it was something they could relate to, and of course not everybody, not even most people ever go down that path. The number of attacks that have been done in the name of Slender Man are, a handful, half a dozen or so. But it doesn't take away the fact that a lot of kids do kind of relate to it. There's no doubt about that. It's kind of like finally, something that understands me, that wants to spend time with me. And it is, it is like a very disturbing, predatory type story.
Well, a lot of rockers throw up the devil horns at a show, but only a few of them become Glenn Danzig. So that's the kind of, that's the, everybody wants to be a rebel, and this is the kind of thing. It's like, this is our secret, and don't tell your parents, and it's dangerous, and it's romantic. It's romantic in a scary kind of tentacled, faceless way, but it has its it has its own thing.
Oh, Slenderman, pucker up. Oh, wait a minute.
Oh, classic Slenderman. Anyway, Allison, do you have any last questions for Nick before we got to let him go off, do more press, and have a nice night?
Oh, come on. We can't let him go. Well, yes, I just want to know, because, you're like writing a book or an article like every 5 minutes. I want to know what your next project or projects are. What can you tell us about what you're researching right now?
All right. Well, I've actually got the new book, Slenderman Mysteries. That's published by New Page Books. But in April, I've got. It's just coincidence they're coming out sort of close together. But in April, I've got a book coming out with my agent's own publishing house called Lisa Hagen Books, and I've done altogether. I've done sort of 4 books on the whole Men in Black / Women in Black, Black-Eyed Children books. There's the On the Trail of the Source of Spies, Real Men in Black, Women in Black, and the 5th one, I'm still not sure it'll ever be the last one, but I'm doing one which comes out in about a month or so. It's called The Black Diary, and it's basically the previous one in the series, if you like, Women in Black, sort of went up to about 2014 thereabouts, and the new one goes right up from then till pretty much the present day, and it's written exactly as how the things happen. So that's why it's called The Black Diary, because it's sort of like it's all rather than having chapters, it's sort of like dates throughout the 3 or 4 years where I had really weird experiences and odd interviews with people, and a lot of weird stuff happened in my apartment as well, and so that's all in there. So it's kind of like a dark diary kind of book, rather than, it is literally kind of written in the style of a diary or a journal.
So it's more about your personal experiences as well, it sounds like.
Yeah, I've actually had there was one period when I was sort of like swamped with stuff, and this was where I was doing something which I do occasionally, and I always regret it, and that was like trying to, open portals and doorways and summon something through. It never ends well. But I've always said to people,
that was your Crowley period.
Well, kind of. But I always tell people, if you want to do it, want to try it, I'm not here to say yes or no. It's down to you. But I've done this on a few occasions, and it's kind of like that situation of it's easy to open the door, but then closing the door to keep it away is a lot harder. But I had a lot of weird stuff happen, like at the height of doing all this. There was one occasion when I had a dream about this really weird looking woman in black, sort of white skin, like plastic or Botox, and I had like a very, very, very extremely very brief paralysis, like sleep paralysis, for maybe 2 or 3 seconds. But in that period, I heard this sort of female deep voice say, "I can help you, just say yes." And I got this really, cold chill that if I said yes, it would kind of like open doors to whatever. And I don't know if you've experienced this at all, but I know a few people who have. The more I dug into this and, trying to focus on these things, I started to see like little sort of black shadows at the corner of my eye, like as if, if you'd seen like a little mouse run across the carpet, you're like, the hell was that? Kind of that situation. That happened quite a few times, and there was like a negative vibe. You could just, like in an atmosphere in the apartment, and I did sort of various cleansing procedures and things like that just to and it actually also impacted on a couple of friends of mine. One friend of mine, Buffy Clary, who lives over in East Texas, and Buffy had a couple of experiences, which is her real name, by the way. It's not a nickname from Buffy the Vampire. Her name really is Buffy.
I was going to say that's a great name. She should be in a band.
And but I loaned her a few books that related to all this kind of stuff. Rituals and rites and summonings, and I swear I'm telling the truth here. Every time, twice when she picked that book up and started to really dig into it, she was involved in 2 electrical storms where she was actually struck by lightning. The apartment on one occasion that she was living in, it fried some of her electrical equipment when she was right in front of it. And then on the other occasion, she was sitting in a hammock in her backyard, and the tree in front of her got struck by lightning. The branch came down, and it was the strike was so close that for like 3 days she felt like ill and weird and just not right. And she ended up actually having 3 strikes like that was so close to be dangerous. And so that's basically what the book's about. It's sort of how I got into what happened in the last 3 years and how all this sort of weirdness happened and how it impacted on friends and colleagues and girlfriends and all sorts of stuff. So.
That's the idea virus. That's H.P. Lovecraft sending that letter to August Derleth or whatever, and then August Derleth wakes up in the middle of the night just hearing, "I can help you, August. Just say yes."
Well, it's so wonderful to talk to you, Nick, and don't be a stranger. We'd love to have you on again many, many times, and because you're always engaging, and we love the depth of your research.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I'll make sure you both get a copy of the new book. If you just remind me of your mailing addresses and a Facebook message or whatever, and then I'll when the copies are ready in April, I'll make sure you get copies. So.
Thank you very much. And so for people who want to pick a copy up of the Slenderman Mysteries, and you're going to want this because it's well-researched, if I do say so myself.
And we're both in it.
Right. But also, it really is, if you're looking for a full examination of this kind of thing, when you get past, if you watch the HBO documentary on Slenderman and you follow the court case and things like that of the tragedy that happened in Waukesha 4 years ago, it gives you an idea that this is much deeper, and also we're in uncharted territory when it comes to how ideas spread and urban legends spread in this world, in the world of the internet and the world of social media, as compared to how things did 1,000 years ago or 500 years ago with stories like the Pied Piper. So,
yeah, and help you put what happened into a larger context.
So, Nick, if people want to buy the book, where do they find it?
Well, they can get it from Amazon, obviously, but you can also buy it off the shelves in Barnes and Noble as well. Most of the Barnes and Nobles have got it in stock. And if people want to contact me, they can reach me at Facebook. There's half a dozen Nick Redferns, but you'll find me. And I'm always happy, if people want to share information, or if they've got questions, because they've had an experience, and people can reach me on Twitter at Nick Redfern UFOs. So, and as I said, I'm always happy to chat with people. I'm not one of these sort of standoffish authors, I think the most important people in the field are the witnesses, because without them, we've got nothing to go on. So, I'm always pleased to sort of, help people out if I can, if they've got questions or they've had a disturbing experience or whatever.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Nick, very much. Thank you, Allison, for joining us, and we'll see you guys on the other side.
All right. Thanks, guys.
Make sure you guys check out the show notes, because you'll be able to pick up a copy of The Slenderman Mysteries, an internet urban legend comes to life by Nick Redfern. You'll be able to pick up your copy in the show notes.
And that's at othersidepodcast.com/186.
186 episodes. Wow, that's a lot of episodes. We've been doing this for a while now. It's still a lot of episodes. And, one of Nick's favorite things to talk about when he's writing about himself is how much he loves punk rock.
Yeah.
And specifically like 70s style punk rock. And
awesome.
We saw this band on their last tour, Wendy.
Yeah, we did. And it was such a great show.
It was. We got to see the Ramones at Lollapalooza in 1996. And that was in Iowa City? Or was it?
I think it was.
Des Moines. No, it was in Des Moines. We went to.
No, it was Des Moines.
That's right. And we got wicked sunburns.
Yes. And sadly enough, just a few weeks ago when I was in Los Angeles, I visited a couple of their graves at the Hollywood Forever Cemetery.
Oh, that's
right.
Johnny
and Dee Dee's graves there.
That's right. And Joey's been dead since 2001, so I think the last Ramone left alive is Marky.
Oh, and we saw him in Chicago with Andrew WK.
Yeah, we did see Marky in Chicago. And then I think Tim's band, our friend Tim, opened up for them in Madison. Marky Ramone and the Invaders like 18 years or 19 years ago. That's back before OK's burned down. Anyway, you guys don't care about that. What you do care about is that Nick Redfern loves the Ramones. So we decided to write a Ramones-inspired track in Nick's honor on the topic of his book. So this is Sunspot with The Slenderman. 9 foot tall in a suit and tie. Oh, 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 the Slender Man. He came from the woods to terrify. Oh, 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 the Slender Man. He'll crawl inside your head space. It looks like he erased his face from the basement of
the gates of hell when we close our eyes to dream. They thought that he was fiction, but he's creeping into facts. When you feel all arms around you, you best dare not turn your back. Your nose bleeds and your sense in dread. Oh, 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 the Slender Man, Pied Piper of the World Wide Web. Oh, 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 the Slender Man. Who knows tenors, knows how it grows, coming through Lovecraftian and cosmos. From the basement of the internet and made out of belief, are we peeking through the gates of hell when we close our eyes to dream? They thought that he was fiction, but he's creeping into facts. When you feel long arms around you, you best dare not turn your back. Oh, 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 the Slender Man. Oh, 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 the Slender Man. Oh, 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 the Slender Man. Beware the Slender Man. Oh, 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 the Slender Man. Oh, 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 the Slender Man. Oh, 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 the Slender Man. Beware the Slender Man.
Thank you for listening to today's episode. You can find us online at othersidepodcast.com. Until next time, see you on the other side.
Oop, we're not done yet, though.
What? I already had my pants off.
No. The fun's not over yet, Mike,
Okay.
because we haven't thanked our Patreons yet.
Oh, the patrons. I love you people.
Yes, patrons, Patreons, call them what you will, but we know what they are, and that is fantastic people who support our program.
Yes.
And our band and the stuff that we do, and they make it possible, basically.
And we love you guys for it. And you can find more information at othersidepodcast.com/donate. You can find the reward levels, and you could be on the same reward level as Dr. Ned, who gets a shout out every single episode. Thank you so much, Ned, for your support. And
Thanks, Ned.
Thank you to each and every one of our patrons for making this happen. Once again, that's othersidepodcast.com/donate.
Have a great week.
Yeah, classic Slender Man. So skinny and terrifying. Classic Slender Man always leaves the tentacles outside. I mean, it's romantic in a scary, kind of tentacled, faceless way. I can help you, August. Just say yes.